Hi, welcome back to Moonbeaming. I could not be more thrilled, excited, honored, stoked to have you back with us this week. I cannot believe we are post solstice. I know that time this year has felt a little bit wobbly. It's been a little bit more difficult to find our exact rhythm. And this is what I'm going to say. A little bird told me, AKA my intuition, that the flow of the year really has started emerging about a month ago. It's been like bubbling up like a babbling brook or a beautiful river. And so by now, trust the flow, trust your intuition, trust what's coming up for you. It can be very easy for us to be caught in a lack or glass half full with Gregorian calendars and time. I've heard from a couple people just this week saying, the year's over. It's over. And that's just not the case. Let's take a moment, breathe, recenter, reground, touch grass. The way that I teach, of course, is cyclical, lunar. There's a reason for that. A lot can happen in one lunar cycle. Those of you who've taken moonbeaming, those of you who've read my book and used the Many Moons Planner, all of the technologies and all of the tools I create are meant to work because they do work. You know it. If you put those tools into place, you know that they'll work. So please remember that a lot can change in one lunar cycle. A lot can change in 1 month. A lot can change in 3 months or in a half year or in a year. So let's have an abundance mentality with our lives, with time, and with our dreams. Okay? Okay. Right now, we are in a waxing moon phase. We will get to celebrate a full moon in about 10 days if you're listening to this on time. And the emphasis is on doing. The emphasis is on getting out of your head, out of your fear, and reattuning and reorienting towards action. So, a really simple way to do that is every day take 1 or 2 smaller steps towards that which you want to be, that which you want to do, that which you would like to experience. Really simple. We just had a round of embodying abundance, and I miss you all already. And I tell everyone, check in with your capacity. Do it within your capacity to build your confidence, right? We don't want to overreach. When we overreach, we rupture trust. And so much of this process is about trusting ourselves, coming into repair with ourselves and the world around us, and moving from there. Okay, I just felt like some folks needed to hear this little reminder. And so it was from my heart to yours. You've got this. My only housekeepings for everyone is that the Moon Studio has a July workshop coming up. It's called How to Feel Your Feelings. You can sign up for that now. All the information is on our website. The link is on the show notes. It's not going to be a crying party. I promise it is going to be a feelings party. It's going to be really fun. And the next piece of housekeeping I have before moving on to this week's episode is the winner of our free tarot reading contest. If you leave a 5-star review for the show, you are put in a drawing to win a free 30-minute tarot reading with myself. I have not done one-on-ones to the public in, I guess, about 3 or 4 years. This is your only chance, and this is a thank you. As you know, this is an independent podcast. It's myself, it's our wonderful editor, Amelia, it's our wonderful assistant, Ro. That's it. We don't have, some corporation behind us. We don't have anyone helping us. It's just us. And so how reviews help us is that it boosts our algorithm. It gets us in front of more people. More people can find us. So if you give us a 5-star review, this is your way of passing it forward. It's your way of giving someone else a gift, someone who might want to benefit from this podcast, who enjoys this podcast. It's also your way of thanking us for all of our work, all of our efforts. Podcasts do not just pop up fully formed like Athena from the head of Zeus. There is a lot of effort. There's a lot of strategy. There's a lot of scripting. There's a lot that go into everything that we do at the Moon Studio. So you get it. I know you get it. I don't talk about this a lot, but I do talk about it enough because I want to remind you that you can help. You can help your favorite podcasters. You can help your favorite independent artists by rating, reviewing, liking, writing a review, sending to a friend, passing on. And the winner of this month's tarot reading contest is username RN Sheila. RN Sheila, thank you for your beautiful review. You are the winner. You have won a 30-minute tarot reading with me. Come on down, email our studio, and let's schedule something soon. Hooray. Okay. Now on to this week's episode. For real. We have a very special guest on this week of the Moonbeaming podcast. We have the one and only Corinna Rosella on the show today. If you are listening to this, there is a good chance you love Corinna's work. You've probably encountered their work before. For many, many years, they had a podcast and an Instagram account called Rise Up Good Witch. They taught many popular classes on all kinds of subjects like flower essence making, herbalism, tarot, and other forms of witchcraft and practice. Corinna is an herbalist, a tarot reader. They stopped doing Rise Up Good Witch. They passed it along, and they started a store in Yucca Valley, California called Milk Thistle. You can check that out. The link will be in the show notes there. For this episode, I wanted to talk to Corinna about their work with the planet Pluto. Corinna has done a lot of research, a lot of personal work, a lot of teaching. They taught a class on Pluto. And to celebrate Pluto switching signs this year, it's in Aquarius, I wanted to talk to someone who had spent a lot of time with the energies and messages of Pluto. So we get into it. We discuss the meanings of Pluto. We talk shadow work. We talk about the blessings and lessons of Pluto. And I know it will give you some great food for thought about how to collaborate with this tiny, intense planet. patrons, there is also an episode with Corinna for you. It's already up or will be up shortly, where we talked about being small business owners and get into all of those kinds of subjects. It's very heart to heart. That'll be up soon, or it's already up again. What is time? What is anything? If it's not there, it'll be there soon. Thank you for your spaciousness with me. And that's our extra episode for the month. But all of you, you're going to love this, whether or not you're interested in astrology. I think there's always something to be gained when we do deep dives into archetypes, into energies, into living with the cosmos, living with nature, living with the universe. So I give you my conversation with the one and only Corinna Rosella. Corinna, I am so happy to have you on the podcast. You and I have known of each other's work for years, been in contact for years, and there's so much I love about you. I love how smart you are. I love how honest you are. I love how, I mean, maybe you get props for this, but I also just like how funny you are. Like you have a really good sense of humor. Usually I introduce people by, their business name or what I think they think, who they think they are. But I also know you're in a bit of a transition. So I would love for you to just introduce yourself to our listeners, wherever you are today. Like, who are you today?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. It's such an honor to be on your show. I love your work. So much mutual respect. And thank you for saying that I'm funny, because that's a thing I try to be. That really is the thing that I try to be. And I'll talk about that, I guess, in context of like some of my work and like my challenges, because we know that humor usually comes from a place of like depth in some way. But who am I? Yeah, that question's always funny, because a lot of times when people answer it, they answer it with like qualifiers that were given by the larger overculture or about the things that we do. But I'm a human being. I live in the Mojave Desert on unceded Sereno and Cahuilla territory. And my pronouns are they, them. I'm queer and non-binary, have fluctuating kind of health issues, chronic pain stuff, currently having a little bit of that. I used to have a podcast called Rise Up Good Witch. So that's the name that I've worked under for about the last 6 years. And now I'm stepping away from that to work in a brick and mortar that I've opened in the small desert community that I live in, where I can do herbal consults, flower essence consults, and be a human being in a community.
Yes. So we're going to talk all about that TBD in a moment. What I wanted to start off talking to you about is this idea of the empath and this idea of highly sensitives, not the idea, like it being a real thing, because we were going back and forth about it when we were originally talking about having you on. I always ask folks like, well, what do they want to talk about? What have you been thinking about? So that we can talk about it. And you had brought up this really interesting take on irresponsible empathy. And I'm going to stop paraphrasing and let you just share your thoughts on it, and we can talk a little bit about that for a while.
Yes, absolutely. So, the word empath, I think it is a real thing. Being highly sensitive is a real thing. You and I have lived experience around that. Some people are more sensitive than others. But the thing that I have a problem with is this idea that being more sensitive than other people makes you better than other people, or makes you more evolved, or like more important. And that's something that I often see in people when they're talking about being an empath. And when I say in people, I'm talking also about a younger me as well. I've always been highly sensitive. I can remember being like a very small child and getting these like intense downloads. Like I'm talking about young enough that I did not yet know how to speak, and feeling like this intense energy of like understanding on this like cellular level that every living thing on this earth has a consciousness and can feel pain and can feel joy, and just that being such an incredibly powerful feeling that was almost like getting hit by lightning. And as you get older, the world changes you. And I remember being a child and being like, why do the adults that I see in my life fight and have drama and always cause problems and chaos? Why are they acting like this? I don't understand like why adults are this way. And then you get older and you have to adapt to a world that's really toxic. And it's inherently toxic because of our histories of hierarchy, of capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, etc. Like we are living in a world that is toxic, that beats these things out of us. So what happens then is that a lot of times empaths become incredibly wounded. And what do we do with our wounding? I think there's a lot of ways that, if we could like rebrand the idea of empathy, I don't even want to suggest that. I don't want to say, let's rebrand empathy, y'all. Like, I don't even, like want to suggest that.
Make empathy empathic again.
Yeah. Yeah. So like, and a lot of people are like, there are no empaths. There's childhood trauma survival. And like, I think that can be true as well. Like, I'm not sure. I don't have any of the answers. I'm not an expert on anything. I'm not a psychologist. But I think like, when you are a highly sensitive person and you grow up in a world that constantly beats you out of it, that shames you, that bullies you, that tells you to repress it, where does that energy go? And, a lot of people that are highly sensitive have struggles with addiction, as I have, or like substance abuse, misuse. People struggle with codependency. I think people even sometimes have like toxic traits, like do things that are emotionally abusive to other people, because that empathy is not managed. And it's just this energy in the body and in the heart that like can't be contained. And therefore is just like kind of going wild all over your life. And I see that, I see that in a younger me. I see that in other younger people. I see that in people older than me. A lot of people who are like, I'm so sensitive, so I'm going to be self-destructive, or I'm going to act out in ways that are inappropriate or hurtful to those around me, or I'm going to hide away my gifts and not share them with others. Whatever it is, there's so many ways that empaths can self-destruct. Empaths can be harmful. Empaths can be abusive. Like this idea, I think that an empath is someone who is all love and light all the time and is like always kind, is always nice, is always says the right thing, and is a total angel, is kind of like a polarizing topic, because the world that we live in is more complex than that. Human beings are more complex than that. Nobody is all good or all bad. So I am an empath, and I know this because I feel it, like if somebody is around me and they're going through something painful and I look at them, that energy comes into my body. And it's very difficult. And I think it wasn't until, I made better decisions for myself, started doing like, a lot of trauma-informed therapy, somatics, like got sober. I didn't know how to manage that. So I was just taking on people's energies all the time. And then that energy would become mine. So taking on people's like, anger, taking on people's sadness, people's feelings of betrayal, whatever it was. And that's something I see in a lot of empaths. And I think as long as we keep with this narrative of like empaths, like lovey and like flowery and like happy all the time and like always like there to help people, then we kind of like negate the experiences of being a human on this extremely corrupt and difficult planet to live on. But also just the fact that like all humans are capable of harm and capable of healing. Empaths are not angels. Like we are mere humans on this earth. We're just highly sensitive.
I mean, there's a couple things going on that I just want to like pull out for people listening as I was listening to you. And the first is for me, being an empath. Like I just want to define that really quickly, because to me, being an empath is different than being highly sensitive. So being an empath, the way that I think of it, is being able to feel other people's energy in your body, whether that's illness or, as you said, emotions, sadness, knowing if they've had a bad day, we can even extend this quite honestly to, and again, the empaths, the empaths listening can probably relate to knowing when someone's lying, like to knowing if someone's acting like they're having a great time, but really they're barely keeping it together, energetically or emotionally by a string, like just sort of being able to discern and deduce, even if we don't always know exactly what's going on, having that feeling. And that's an issue for a lot of reasons that we can get into and that you've also gotten into. And then the other thing I think of, which as being different, but of course, one person can be both. Sounds like you're both. I am both. And that's being highly sensitive, AKA having a sensory processing disorder, like having issues with sensory processing. And what I mean exactly, I mean, I hate the terminology disorder. I really even hate labels because of the labeliness of all of it. But, if we think of sensitivities as a spectrum, right? And there's someone who's very, very sensitive to light or to sound or to touch, to any of the senses. And so then they might get overwhelmed. They might get overwhelmed if, like for me, it's when dogs bark. I feel it really intensely in my body. It's like very dysregulating to me. And I've had to really like work with that energetically and somatically so that I don't like fall over into a ball when I'm walking my dogs, because I have dogs and my dogs bark and then other dogs bark. And it's just like my version of a personal hell sensory wise, like so much so that, for years I wouldn't go to a dog park just because I was going to have a nervous system meltdown. Like actually it was going to take me hours to recover, from the noise, from the experience, all of that stuff. So there's being highly sensitive, which is that we experience life like as if the volume is turned up on maybe everything or on a couple of different things. Like maybe it's taste for one person or another person. It might be like they can only wear certain kinds of clothing, like they can't wear anything scratchy or, and of course this also veers into, and we're not going to talk about this today, but of course there are other associations with that, whether it be autism or ADHD or, neurodivergence. But again, these things are separate. You can be all of the things. You could be like an empathic, highly sensitive, autistic person with ADHD, and you could just have like a couple or just one. But to me, they're these distinct things. And I think that the empath one is interesting because now that you're breaking it down, it is an odd way to set up almost like a weird power dynamic, as if, well, I can feel your pain, therefore, dot, dot, dot. Therefore, I can like tell you what to do, or therefore, you hurt my feelings, or therefore, it's codependency to me at its best because, saying to someone, oh, you're feeling sad or you're having a bad day, could you not feel that? Or, buck up. I mean, we see it in our culture anyway. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you see as being maybe ways that empaths could be maybe a bit more responsible with like their empathy, what you've done. I know you named some of the things. What are some boundaries you put into place or some practices you put into place around your empathy?
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing all of that. I totally agree with everything you're saying. One thing that I think about a lot, that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, that I'm sure we've emailed about before regarding like being able to pick up on other people. So I have a thing, I'm sure I've told you this. I'm like allergic to people's lack of authenticity. It's like something I feel right away. Like I'm a neurodivergent person. It's really hard for me to like know like when is the appropriate time to talk about this subject and when do I need to be professional, which was one
Yeah.
reason it's great working for myself, and I have to wear, a lot of masks, because I'm very energetically sensitive, and it's hard for me to be around, like you're saying, a lot of stimulus, a lot of people. And that's part of my humor, as well as like trying to like disarm, like feel comfortable. When you make people laugh, like it feels more, you're like, okay, it's like a nice
Mhm.
vibe going on here.
Mm.
But I think like one pattern that I see in some empaths. Of course, there are the people who are like, I know you're going through a lot, but I'm empathic. So like, I just can't sit with you through this right now. It's like,
Mm.
okay, like, I think that's whatever. Everybody has their capacity for sitting with people and being with people and holding space. But I do see that sometimes with like, oh, I just can't be with you through this right now, this thing that you're going through because I'm sensitive. But I think something that I see empaths doing that I have been guilty of that I am working on is sometimes you're around someone and you're like, they're upset, something's going on. Is it me? That's where like that childhood trauma, like, is it my fault? It must be my fault, like that
Mm.
Taylor Swift lyric where you're like, okay, it's my fault. I did something wrong. But I think also like just because you can sense something doesn't give you the right to like pry into that person's life. And I've had that. Like I've had people tell me, not, recently in my life, but when I was a lot younger, like if they're going through something, they probably don't. They're like, if I don't call you back, it's because I know I'm not going to be able to lie to you. You're going to know that something's going on and I don't want to talk about it. And I just can't be fake around you. So I think like that's one thing, just because you can sense something about someone, even sometimes, picking up right away. I know that you have this as well where you meet someone and you're like, there's something off here. That's the lack of authenticity for me. Or people that get really latched on really fast and like try to get you to open up really quick. There's something, as I've gotten older and developed my intuition more and like learn to trust it, I'm better at like understanding that I need to put a boundary with people that kind of set off my alarm because my intuition is always right. I think everyone's intuition is usually right when you learn how to decipher intuition from fear. But I think like, having boundaries as an empath, like, first of all, I'm a former social worker. Totally, looking back, had complete and total savior complex around so many things, like a total, like, I have to make everyone happy and save everyone and help everyone and get an award for it and do the best at it in order to like earn the right to breathe and drink water.
Yeah.
Like that kind of thing. Like I went through all of that in my younger years and all that did was make me an empty person who had a hard time connecting with other people, had a hard time like being vulnerable or open or like healthy, in my relationships. And I think like empaths need to recognize like we need kind of like a hygiene, like an empath hygiene.
I mean, this is literally what I teach. Like I teach boundaries for highly sensitive people. I teach energetic hygiene classes. And a couple of things you just said that I just want to underscore. One is we need to have boundaries energetically as well. So what you said about noticing someone's having a hard day or, they clearly seem to be out of sorts, letting someone have that. And as you've said, not making it about you, not trying to, another thing that happens a lot with particularly younger people, children who are highly sensitive and empathic, is that a lot of times they are the energetic processor in the family or the energetic processor in the school, like in their cluster, which means that they either unconsciously and then it turns into a coping mechanism, a coping strategy, and then it turns into a pattern, and then it turns into maybe even an identity or a trauma. They will take on other people's energy. They will process it through their body. They will either like literally take it on like a sponge in the sense of, okay, well, if I take on this energy, if I hold it, if I process it, I'm doing this service to the other person or to the stability or homeostasis of the larger group. And, for me, when I used to do in-person groups, this would never happen to me one-on-ones when I was a psychic tarot reader. But when I would do groups in person, and this would never really happen online, but it would happen in person because a lot of the work I do is really transformative and it's really intimate. Afterwards, I would just sob. I would not be having a bad day. Like I would be fine. And I would just have a major, like energetic, emotional come down and I would just sob. And when I realized that I, for whatever reason, was doing that old pattern I had picked up in childhood of let me take all your energy, let me take your stuff. Then this maybe can be my identity, or that's another thing I want to talk about with you, like the healer, I'm putting this in quotes, the healer identity, and how that it sometimes can flow into codependency or flow into, just as what you've said, like just being in an identity of a martyr or a savior, or like, again, well, I'm putting a pin in that. We'll come back to that. So when I realized that, and that was years ago, it was like 2012 or something, I was like, oh, this isn't mine. These aren't my tears. We really need to tighten up our energetic hygiene. We really have to make sure that this doesn't happen, because I really see it as being an irresponsible practitioner. I'm not saying we need to be robots and like totally turned off. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I am saying that we need to let people hold enough space for them to process their energy. And if I'm coming in and trying to fix it or process it, or energetically like trying to take it or hold it inside of my body, inside of my space, I'm certainly not doing myself a service, but I'm also doing the other person a disservice, because they're not getting to be like with their emotions and their feelings. Like they don't get to figure out their own energetic hygiene or like have their own full experience.
100%. I feel you on that. I also I don't do as many readings anymore because I realize, like, if I do a lot of readings in one day, I have a huge pain flare up. I get incredibly depressed, crying, depleted. I call it energetically dehydrated, is how I feel.
Love that.
That is one thing that I learned like later on through, I think a lot through like the harm reduction philosophy, is like, to really support someone and to really be in community with someone and to really love someone, you're not trying to fix all their problems. You're not trying to like do the things for them. That's like annoying. I'm sure you've had people do that to you where you're like having a hard time and they're like, I'm going to fix everything. And you're kind of like, okay, back off. Like, no, you're not a special savior. Like, and that's, its own special form of like some narcissism in a way, of being like, it's me. I'm the one that's going to help everybody. So I think like it's really important to recognize that everyone has within them their own ability to heal. And the kindest thing that you can do for someone is to recognize that they have the answer within them and that you
Yeah.
can guide them, you can support them. It's almost like they're walking on a tightrope and you're
Yeah.
walking right beside them with your arms around them, not touching them, but like there in case they fall, but you know that they can walk that line on their own. And I think that's like the best way to function as a healer, is to be like, I believe in your ability to heal and I believe in my ability to heal. And I want, for me and like my interpersonal relationships, those are the kind of relationships I try to cultivate. It's like we all believe in each other.
Yeah.
Do what we need to do to get through things. So I think like that's a visualization that I practice, is just like,
Yeah.
I visualize even with people who have been abusive to me, which is not, maybe 2 years from now, you'll talk to me and I'll be like, I don't do that anymore. But just being like, I hope that you heal. And I don't, I'm not there to receive any of this anymore from you. And I'm not here to like guide you or help you or absolve you. But like, I still hope and believe that you'll be able to heal way over there, like out of my life, out of my vision.
And I think that for me personally, I don't think I've ever said this out loud. So I don't like the word healer, because for me, it implies that, oh, I am going to heal you. I am going to sprinkle this fairy dust or give you these words or give you this energy. And that to me creates a very strange power dynamic that I do see as being a replicator of white supremacist culture, of this authoritative person that you have to like, oh, please, sir, may I have another healing? Or like, creates some kind of codependency with client and healer. It also sort of sets up this odd dynamic where the healer doesn't have any problems, or the healer doesn't have anything that they have to work on, which is not true at all. We all have our stuff, or we all have our material, as you've said. So that's why I don't call myself a healer. That's why I'll never call myself a healer. That's why I'm pretty suspicious of people who kind of do that in a more metaphysical sense. Like if I go to my chiropractor, or like my massage therapist, or my speech pathologist or something. To me, that's sort of more in the veins of healing because they're like giving me physical relief or, something like that. So for me, I think we have to be careful about how we're talking about healing and what we're actually doing and what we're providing and how we're communicating that. Because the other thing, now that we're like being completely honest before we move on to an even more honest topic, which is a certain planet that you're a fan of. But I think that I see a lot of vague language around certain healing practitioners, like, well, what are you actually doing? What can I actually expect? And also, a lot of the people in the healing arts, I will use that word, who I respect are showing people how to do the thing. They're like, okay, here's how you set energetic boundaries. Here's how to think about approaching ... Like they themselves are like, okay, here are these different tools, here are these different techniques. Let's all explore and practice together so that everyone can become more adept and everyone can become more energetically grounded or more responsible or more compassionate or more self-loving, so on and so forth.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I don't consider myself a healer per se. I do healing work. It's kind of hard to figure out what word feels the most appropriate. But again, it's like, I think it comes down to, for me, like identifying more with being a channel. Because for a long time, I had a hard time identifying as a channel or as a psychic because I was like, well, that sounds really grandiose and like really, that sounds really egotistical to be like, I'm a channel or whatever. And then I was like, but actually, that's what it feels like. It doesn't feel like it's me, Corinna, doing this healing work for someone. It feels like I can be a vessel to open myself up to offer healing to someone else that really is catalyzing the healing that exists within them. And to me, that's like totally void of ego, which goes into the planet stuff, but I think like it is. And I wish that, I love that you do this work. And I've definitely like learned a lot from you. I took a class that you did about this a couple of years ago, and I definitely learned a lot from you. And I think, the people that do the healing need to go to healers also, or, healers also.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think you're right about that hierarchical idea of like, there's the healer in the community and the healer doesn't need anything from anyone. When you were talking about that, like, I can take on all the pain of the world. When you said that, I had like distinct memories of myself in my 20s being like, give me all the suffering in the world. I'll like take it so everybody else can be happy, and like thinking that made me such a good person to like think that thought, and really that's like, one principle that I've been trying to live by is this idea of like, we are a part of our own communities. So if we are out here trying to heal our communities and help our communities, but we're neglecting ourselves, then we're not doing anything because we're all connected. We're all integral.
100%. And so let's do a little dance around our friend Pluto.
Yeah.
So you said ego and Pluto.
Yep.
Let's start there because I hadn't heard that before.
Yeah. So, I am a student and a lover of evolutionary astrology. And in evolutionary astrology, there's a big focus on like the soul path, the nodal axis, and how Pluto plays a part in like understanding, like undoing past life trauma, ancestral trauma, etc. And the first time I learned about Pluto was in 2016, which was like pretty much like the worst year of my life. And Pluto was transiting, my Capricorn stellium during that time. It was at the pinnacle of my moon and my Mercury at that point in time. So I didn't ever know about Pluto. I didn't really know all that much about astrology, except like, what a sun, moon, and rising was.
Yeah.
But when I took my first astrology class and the teacher started talking about Pluto, I just remember being like, that's it. Like this is the language about something that I've always known existed and I've never had words for. And when that astrologer looked at my chart, I have a very Plutonian chart, and the astrologer said, like, you have a harder time than other people. Like, it's not your imagination. You're not exaggerating. Life is hard for you. You struggle more than other people. But because you struggle, you have like an amazing ability to transform. And I was, and I, and it was when she was talking about Pluto. And in that moment, I was just like, this is it. Like, this is the thing. Like, what is this? And the thing about Pluto, it is the farthest out planet. It often gets, aside from an evolutionary astrology, which has a heavy focus on the outer planets, in a lot of other like Western Vedic forms of astrology, Pluto is often neglected or not considered super important. There is a lot of discourse about the Pluto return amongst like different practices within astrology. But I think Pluto specifically is about that wound, that hidden part of the self, I think, that feels like it cannot be transformed. And it's a lot about ancestral trauma. It's the intergenerational family patterns. When we look at the ways that cycles of violence play out in families. And again, like I worked with teenagers, at-risk teenagers for years, and I did it long enough that I saw them become adults. And I knew what families they came from and like what their families went through. I know my own family. I know the patterns, the toxic patterns in my own family. And it's something that's incredibly difficult to break. And family trauma is difficult to break, especially when living in capitalism and white supremacy. If you are not a super, upper class, rich, white, suburban family. And even then, like,
I would argue, even then, it's difficult.
Yeah. Even if you have access to therapy, like it's difficult to break these patterns. So for me, like Pluto gave me this language. And when I talk about ego, it's because Pluto is about, it's about larger structures. And when we look at like the state of the world that we live in today with like, the greatest difference, like the greatest disparity, even since, the pandemic, even more so between like the rich and the poor, state-sanctioned violence continuing, like movements towards fascism, a lot of like charismatic leadership that's really oppressive and dictatorship-like on the rise as well. And of course, we can say like these things always existed, but the fact that they are so prominent and out in the open right now, and that we're, who knows, like a lot of astrology points towards civil war in 2024, 2025. Whole nother thing, world war as well, with what's going on. But when we look at all of these things, I think like Pluto is this catalyst for being like, how do we break out of this cycle? And I think it has a lot to do with the ego, because I think like, spiritual ego, and I've been guilty of it in my life, is that like, I'm going to take on the pain. Me, I'm the martyr, like kill me, like throw all the pain of the world at me. I can metabolize it so you don't have to.
So what I hear you saying with the ego is that as you're discussing it, it is a wounded part of us. Maybe it's like some people could refer to it as our shadow bits or our, repressed bits or whatever, what we feel shame around, what we feel deep pain around, that functions in subconscious, sometimes conscious ways as a protective device, a coping strategy that isn't necessarily the most healthiest for us, literally and spiritually. Is that correct-ish?
Yes. Thank you for like stopping me with that, because I realize that I sometimes go into talking about ego without considering the fact that a lot of people have different ideas about what ego is. I am familiar and I do like study the teachings of Carl Jung, but like I don't necessarily feel that when I speak about ego, I'm talking about the idea of like not having a self. I think that it's okay to have a self, but I think in the context of like a capitalist white supremacy, the self is about power. And the ego is about power, not the self. The ego is about power. It's about, especially in the context of white supremacy, I'll say, as a white person. To speak specifically to that, I think like white people in general, we don't have a lot of structures or models for unlearning the ways that we've been conditioned to like collude with white supremacy. And like even, and I think this is true for anyone that benefits from any type of systemic privilege, admitting that you have that privilege can be a very challenging thing for some people that have a lot of ego, because to admit that you have privilege suddenly, aligns you with like some horrific oppressions that have happened in the world in some ways. And it can also some people feel vulnerable when they admit mistakes. I think that I had that in my younger years as well. But I think the ego wants to protect itself. The ego wants to be seen in the best light. The ego wants to be looked up to and revered. It doesn't want to be vulnerable.
Well, the ego wants to be like loved and safe and not disrupted, like on any level, especially if you are a trauma survivor. I think that's just, again, not a psychologist over here, but just my own thoughts on that, just speaking for myself. If you're a trauma survivor, if you have a very perilous or ambivalent relationship to power, if you like either are terrified. I see a lot of folks just literally being terrified of power, as you said, don't want to admit the power that they do have because we've been also raised to see power as like a weapon or something that is negative. Starhawk and other practitioners talk a lot more about power being positive and the ways in which we can practice power that are generative and collaborative. I think power is going to be a major theme. I mean, well, it will always be a major theme, right? I really appreciate that you're talking about ego contextually, societally, culturally, and the ways in which we are programmed subconsciously, unconsciously, the ways in which we're socialized, the ways in which we've learned certain coping strategies and certain mechanisms. And then also I see, as you're talking about ego and Pluto, and maybe you can talk about this now, is these cages we don't even know we're in. Like I look back on things I've done and they're so similar to my parents. And I'm someone who definitely doesn't want to necessarily be completely like my parents, but they're so similar. I'm like, oh, I'm in this subconscious, unconscious cage pattern that was probably started before I was born. They were taking on their patterns. And like, so that's why I hear you talking about the link between ancestry and Pluto and these like larger patterns, because Pluto's orbit, how many years does it take? Like 200 or no, like Pluto's
around 250 more or less, depending on like retrogrades. Yeah.
right. And so there's a couple other things I wanted to ask you. The first is you said that your chart is very Plutonian.
Yep.
What do you mean when you say that?
Well, it's sort of like an intuitive thing for me, but I do have Pluto in the first house in a conjunction with my ascendant. So I think that's like one of the main things for me that
Mhm.
has kind of like made me feel like a very Plutonian person. And actually, it's a thing that I notice a lot of times when people are like, I don't really relate to my chart. I feel like I'm way more unstable and like
Mm.
I've had way more emotional issues than like being a Capricorn because like like so I've heard that from other people and then I'm like, okay, but you have Pluto in the first house.
So, for people who know nothing about astrology, to say a planet is conjunct with something, it means that it's very, very close, which in astrological speak means it's like influencing and like a part of the thing it's next to, right? So like a twin or something. They're in tighter conjunction
Mhm.
to each other. And so you saying that it's in the first house, most astrology sees the first house as the house of self. So if you have planets in that first house, especially if they are in orb, like if they're in close degree to the degree of your rising, then there might be that influence and that emphasis on certain characteristics or energies of that planet. And of course it changes with, other oppositions or squares or trines or, there's charts are can get so complicated. But I just was curious. Like I was like, oh, is Corinna talking about like, is your chart ruler like Mars or like what's the deal?
No, actually, my chart, I'm in the Pluto and Libra generation. So my chart ruler is actually Venus.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm a Capricorn moon, sun, Mercury, and South node. So because Pluto's been in Capricorn since 2008, for those of us with a lot of Capricorn in our chart, especially our inner planets, we've been really affected by Pluto in the last, 12 years. So I consider myself to have a Plutonian chart. That might not be the language that an astrologer would use about my chart, especially maybe not someone who uses evolutionary astrology. But for me, I consider my chart to be very Plutonian.
So let's get into translation because Pluto is an energy, Pluto is an archetype, Pluto is an activator, Pluto is a mirror. That's how I think of the planets. At least there are these different ways we can interact and collaborate with the planets. What are some of the positive aspects of Pluto, or what are some like really transformative or refreshing ways you have collaborated with the energies of Pluto over the last few years or more?
Yes, I think it's really important to acknowledge like the power in Pluto because Pluto is the shadow, and the thing about the shadow is that what we cannot see operates unconsciously. So everybody has some type of a shadow, and it manifests in different ways for every person. But I think like for the Plutonian work is looking into that shadow because many people do not look at I mean, look at the people that we have in power. People don't want to look at their shadow, and yet it just grows and grows. It gets more and more powerful when you ignore it. So to me, like when you kind of like offer yourself up to Pluto, when you work in collusion with Pluto, Pluto's like, I'm going to put this in front of you. It is, it's the tarot card associated with Pluto is judgment. And I think about that because judgment's the second to the last card in the majors. So it's sort of like, are we going to go into this chapter with some of our patterns, or are we going to leave those patterns behind and go into this chapter in a new, fresh kind of way? So I think like when we work with Pluto, Pluto gives us insight, it gives us deep healing, it gives us transformation. On a structural level, I really see evolved Pluto as like abolition of police and prison systems and like all systems of state sanctioned punishment. I see Pluto as accountability and transformative justice, like the willingness to look within and to be like, well, how have I colluded with these systems of oppression that exist in a larger scale? And instead, like our whiteness has taught us to be like, oh no, it's not me. It's not like I'm good. Like I'm fine. Like I'm not, it's that shame. Pluto is a lot about shame. So to work with Pluto is to be like, I give myself into this. Like my ego isn't trying to protect me from the reality that I am a mere human on this earth. I am capable of making mistakes, but I am capable of healing them. We live in such a throwaway culture that is so much about like someone makes a mistake. No, they're done. But like the reality is like that's a projection. Yeah. Because everybody makes a mistake. There are no angels and there are no devils. Like we're all just humans. And some people choose to do really, really awful, horrible, like power hoarding things with their lives. And I also understand some of those people have no desire to heal, and they never will. But there's a lot of people out there that have been systemically punished, systemically, the prison industrial complex is an example of that. And that comes from like this sort of unevolved Pluto of being like, we can't look at the things that we don't want to see. We have to put them somewhere where we don't see them anymore. So I think like healing of this world, not to be like cheesy, but like the healing of humanity rests upon the ability to do the work in like looking at the parts of ourselves and our communities and our societies that we've tried to shut the door on for so long.
So Pluto feels like it's quite a bit about shadow work.
Yeah.
And looking at those maybe shameful or harder aspects of self, putting a mirror up to yourself with clarity in order to make changes, to make uncomfortable changes. And I would also say like and in order to forgive yourself, because you and I, like, I just also want to be clear. It's like, I'm not a friend. I'm not a pal of abuse apologism. I'm especially not a pal of like repeated abuse apologism, but we're just talking just real basic, the ways in which like unconscious or subconscious compulsions or patterns or beliefs that we have about ourselves that are both very inflated or very deflated, right? That are very much like either they're extreme, like I'm the best and I can do no wrong, or like I'm a piece of poo poo and no one should even look at me ever. It's this is like the spectrum of the ego. When I think of a healthy ego, it's like a little bit of this, a little bit of that, right? Like it's like, yes, We're all just people. I've got some room to grow. And also, I am not a piece of poo poo. Like, I am a human being who deserves like love and respect and compassion. So it's like looking at those, taking accountability, often just looking at it is taking accountability, and then changing the way we relate to ourselves and or to others. But I also feel like as you're talking about Pluto, and forgive me if I'm wrong, I mean it feels really deep. It feels like there's so much there. I always think of the judgment card. If I ever do a tarot deck, I will call judgment awakening, because it's this like waking up, but it's an uncomfortable waking up. It's like, oh, I'm not just, I was sharing with my students in one of the classes I did this autumn. It's like a lot of times spiritual awakenings, you are understanding that you are much more than whatever labels or identities you've given yourself or that have been given to you. You're like, oh, I'm a spirit. Oh, I mean, I don't know what you believe in. I believe in reincarnation. So I'm like a spirit. This time around, like I'm much greater and much bigger. I'm also part of the whole. I'm also nothing. I'm all the things, right? So it feels Pluto to me as you're describing it feels so vast and so big. And it's interesting as I'm speaking, like even the funny thing about Pluto is that there's a controversy about Pluto, right? Like some astrologers are like, is it a planet? Should it matter? Should we even be talking about Pluto? And then some people are like, it's this big thing. And, there's even that to me feels like Plutonian and hilarious and meta. Maybe like to close, if someone does want to collaborate with Pluto, where can they begin?
Good question. And I want to say also, I think abuse apologism is an example of unevolved Pluto. Because again, like if someone who has been abusive systemically wants to like work on their behavior and like change their patterns, that's an accountability thing. That's about like uplifting, that's about not taking up a bunch of space. And like I could talk about that for a long time with just like I follow a lot of like pop culture things that happen where someone causes harm and then like watch how they, what they do to respond to it. So I think like Pluto is about like, yeah, you can heal, but like this is going to be work and there's a lot of accountability around it. And I think like, so one thing that I always like to say is like, if somebody is exiting an abusive relationship or they have been very, I'll just say like if someone has been abused and they're like in that process of like recovering from that, I don't think that's the right time to be like shadow work all the time. I mean, maybe,
Yeah.
but like that might not be the time because that person's probably already feeling an
Yes.
immense amount of weight of their experience. But I do think what we can look out is this idea of like what is the part of us that we are afraid for other people to see, like what's the part of us that we try to hide because it's shameful to us. And that goes kind of like back to like humor, like can you laugh at that part of yourself? And obviously like, if you've done something really really horrible, maybe also laughing is not your first thing to do, like there's some accountability that needs to take place. But I think like a first step people can do to work with Pluto is to just think about the parts of themselves that they hide from, or that they hide from others. And obviously in this world that we live in, like we don't want, again, like my neurodivergence is like, when do I talk about what to what people? And like, when
Yeah.
accidentally saying something I shouldn't be saying, So I
Right.
that to be aware of, but just thinking about the parts of ourselves where we hold that shame, that fear, and also like you saying, like recognizing the unevolved family dynamics and like how they sort of like inform the way that we move through society. So like looking at some of those, and they're different for everyone, so it's really hard for me to say.
For sure. One thing I also did want to say as you were talking that sparked my interest too is like the question you had about, what do you not want people to see? I think for a lot of us, it's our brilliance or it's like our special gifts or it's like what we're really interested in and passionate about or what we want to create or what we want to say that we're afraid to say or some form of expression that we have, creative or not, even just self-expression, right? The way we dress or the way we speak or dancing or whatever. And that feels really healing and scary and theoretically Plutonian as well.
Yes, actually, that reminds me if I can share, the first reading I ever got, like when I was learning tarot 13 years ago or something. Now, I met someone who was also a reader, and they were like, "Let me read for you." You know, I never got a reading before I started reading, and the two cards, like there was a lot of cards, but there were two in the center, and he pointed to them, and it was the sun and the five of wands, and he said, why do you try to destroy your own brilliance? Like, why do you create, why are you your own worst enemy? Like, you have so much power and light, and you beat
Mm.
it out of yourself. And I still think about that. So like, it reminds me of what you're saying is, yeah, like that is the shadow work, is like that self abandonment that trauma survivors tend to go through.
Corinna, we could be here all day. We're going to be here a little more. It's such a pleasure and so wonderful. We'll put all your links in the show notes. Are there ways folks can work with you? What are you open to at this time?
If you're around Joshua Tree National Park, I just opened a shop called Milk Thistle in Yucca Valley. And you can come by and get a reading from me, get a custom flower essence, talk about Pluto, your Plutonian wound. Find me IRL, and my website will be in the show notes because I don't know what the new one is going to be yet.
Love it. Thank you so much. All right, that's what we've got. I hope this was useful. If you loved it, please give Milk Thistle a follow. Let Corinna know what you loved about it. Let them know that you were listening and that you appreciate them. It's always nice to share some love around. Be good to yourself, be good to one another. And I'm sending you lots of love. I'll be back soon. Bye for now.